There's a breakthrough in the Jeffrey Epstein case. We've learned now that the feds had a money laundering case against him that they didn't bring. I'm Ari Melber, MSNBC anchor, chief legal correspondent, and I'm going to talk about that in this breakdown, as well as Donald Trump's efforts to control the military, affect our democracy, and also try to stave off the belief or awareness that he is a lame duck president, something I've discussed in a breakdown, including the efforts to suggest to people that somehow he could illegally rule beyond 2028. But starting with Epstein, there are two big reports new from the New York Times and Bloomberg, which uses Freedom of Information Act reporting to get documents about the Epstein case. This is really significant to learn that there was actually an entire money laundering case prepared against Epstein that was basically blocked back the first time he was under investigation. It's really interesting as a lawyer to look at these type of scenarios because typically when someone is under federal or any type of investigation, you don't hear about it in real time. You're not supposed to. You might hear about a search warrant or subpoena, but that's it. And that kind of secrecy is generally a good thing. It's to protect a lot of the parties involved. But we're learning now that in 2007, a federal prosecutor drafted, and I'm reading from documents collected by Bloomberg, a 53-page indictment and an 82-page prosecution memo. That is pretty detailed, all about the effort to get Epstein on money laundering charges, basically of all the different crimes that, of course, he was ultimately suspected of, and later a lot of evidence has shown what he was doing. This was a follow the money effort to go that way. And the report notes that, and this has been reviewed by DOJ as well, but reading from Bloomberg now, that this prosecutor wanted them to act quickly, the feds, because she was concerned that he would continually, to quote, sexually abuse girls until they stopped him. But instead, senior officials, this was at the George W. Bush Justice Department, said she was actually being too aggressive in going after Epstein. They slow-walked that effort. Of course, the money laundering case was never brought, and he got that early sweetheart deal in Florida in 2007. The other big report here that sheds a lot of light on this is from the New York Times about JPMorgan. The biggest bank, really, by most estimates, that exists. Epstein was a valued client. There's been prior reporting that suggests that some of the bankers he was dealing with there also were having some sort of liaison or relations with people in Epstein's orbit. And while that might not have amounted to a crime, it could amount to a conflict of interest for the bank if those individuals were somehow compromised with Epstein, because there were all these warning signs and all of these debates within the bank about to cut him off. And I want to make a point here. There's been a lot of talk about the politics, about the different VIPs involved. And there certainly is a lot of evidence that the powerful and rich people involved might have shielded Epstein for a time. But there were also big institutions involved. The Justice Department hasn't come out looking very good, and that's our United States Justice Department under both parties. The original sweetheart deal was under Republican Bush administration. The Biden administration was in charge for 4 years and was not exactly a model of transparency. They did an Inspector General report about Epstein's suspicious death, but they didn't answer a lot of the key questions, and they certainly didn't do the transparency of releasing the files. The Trump administration claimed they would in the second term. They obviously have not. We're awaiting a vote in the House that is supposed to release the DOJ files, but that's all the DOJ. Then you have the fact that this kind of alleged human trafficking, convicted in the case of Maxwell, not resolved in the case of Epstein legally because he died in prison, but this kind of trafficking involves money. And at a grand level, it involves institutions and banks. And so the questions hanging still over JPMorgan and its leadership about how they did this work for this long are significant and go to the conspiracy here. And I don't mean a conspiracy theory. I mean an actual legal conspiracy where different parties play different roles, but two or more people may conspire to advance crimes. I want to read a little bit from the JPMorgan story, and I also want to make a point about how we learn facts. There's a lot of skepticism these days of all kinds of media. But the reason that we know some of these new reports today, which also put pressure on the Trump DOJ and President Trump, and I'll get to that, let's be clear, these came out because of reporting. And the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, which may have sort of different associations, at times very independent, it's seen as often critical of the government or Trump. The Wall Street Journal, owned by Rupert Murdoch, along with Fox News, but both these papers did the request. There was lawsuits that helped kind of jangle free some of this information, and then these papers requested to get more of it that has been in secret. And in the JPMorgan case, the bank didn't want more of this to come out. Judge Rakoff was appealed basically by the New York Times reporters in their case and ordered the release of this material. So in a time of great skepticism about a lot of things, let's be clear, it's from that type of reporting, often done in sort of slow, behind-the-scenes, boring ways, week after week, filing freedom of information suits, going to court, interviewing people, and then you get information like this. I want to mention that the JPMorgan example turns out that they submitted to the government these what are called suspicious activity reports, saying that many of the transactions that Epstein was involved in were actually suspicious. So that tees you off to potential money laundering. Money laundering matters because, just to say it obviously, if you're in legitimate business, you don't need to launder your money. Now, you could have legitimate business and only be hiding money for tax purposes, tax evasion. That could be a one type of financial crime. But often money laundering correlates to, of course, other worse crimes, violent crimes, human trafficking, international narco trafficking, or drug dealing. And so it matters that these banks, when they're dealing with these funds, file these reports. Here's the problem for JPMorgan, and something people might care about. They didn't file a lot of these reports, according to the Times, until after Epstein died. So it almost makes them look worse, like they had the information, they knew the things. There is a private process and a requirement where they have to make a good faith effort to know their customer, review materials, and flag things to the government, which then can determine whether it is actually suspicious or maybe it's just a transfer that looked funny but is fine. But they didn't do this till after Epstein died. And we're not talking about small sums here. In total, it was over 4,000 transactions and $1 billion that they then flagged. Now remember, Donald Trump's own cabinet official alleged or said that Epstein was a great blackmailer, and that's how he got away with so much, because not only was he doing allegedly these terrible things, some proven, some alleged, but he would then implicate other people in government, in finance, and blackmail them. Now that's what Lutnick said. That hasn't been proven, but it contradicts the Trump DOJ memo that claimed there was no blackmail done, that there was nothing else to see here, nothing else to investigate. And so you have a big problem when you have these conflicting accounts from within the Trump administration. You have President Trump continuing to refuse to do this transparency he promised, and then these new reports come out and give you some insight into what was going on. Obviously, if JPMorgan thought these items were suspicious after Epstein died, well, the same fact should have been suspicious before he died. And it raises the questions of whether people were compromised or hiding or in cahoots, all those kind of things. I'm just looking at something I wanted to mention in my notes here. The money laundering probe that was prepared was never prosecuted. There was a non-prosecution agreement made. That's basically the sweetheart deal that Epstein got the first time in 2007 that said he wouldn't be prosecuted if he made this deal, and so those other things sort of went away. As for JPMorgan, Epstein provided financial value to them. If you want to understand this, it's not all just some simple conspiracy around the worst alleged sex offenses. He was bringing in clients, links to all kinds of top people, Google founder, millions of dollars coming in. So they may have also viewed him as someone that they thought was profitable, and the money trumped, so to speak, those other obligations they have. And so when you look at these problems of this human trafficking, it's not just where the government fell down, it's other institutions that basically may have operated to not only support it, but to hide it, which is bad, obviously. The reporting also shows a reference to two U.S. presidents, believed to be President Clinton and President Trump, that JPMorgan flagged amidst all these other transactions. So they basically had all of this at a time where, for many years, Epstein was still holding himself out as some sort of financial luminary. Now they say he's a criminal and a con man and a blackmailer, but he's out there doing all that, but he couldn't do that without the cooperation of these top institutions. They also mentioned in the report some very high-profile people, Lex Wexner, who was a big entrepreneur and tied to Victoria's Secret, Conrad Black, who I've mentioned before, the Epstein reporting was someone who was funneling many millions of dollars to Epstein, but it never really made sense why. And so there are these questions of whether that was a kind of hush money or even illegal blackmail or extortion money, because Epstein wasn't even a qualified financial advisor for the types of tax services that Black sort of said was what he was paying for. When you take this all together, it brings you back, of course, to the Trump DOJ right now. If the New York Times and Bloomberg and these lawsuits can find all of this information, if there was a money laundering case all the way back in 2007, and that doesn't mean that it proves there was money laundering legally. It means that one prosecutor wanted to bring that case and others maybe didn't see a case, and that does happen. But if you go back that many years and you have that much material, and then you have Pam Bondi say in this infamous memo, there's no other crimes to be pursued, nobody else to be investigated, and no, quote, blackmail, the credibility of the Trump DOJ continues to really fall on this. So that's an update there on a big story. And again, it's one where we are learning actual new information because of documents and because of reporting. I understand a lot of people might be skeptical about, after all these years, if the House votes to get the Epstein files, will there be anything in there? We don't know. But it certainly would be interesting to use legal process to force that material out and then compare it to some of the other stuff I just mentioned. Because then you'd start to look at the names, look at the banks, look at the old effort to develop a case, and ask the question that still matters to the victims and the system, which is, did anyone else get away who did something, who's still out there, who's alive, and was this covered up and quieted down for the wrong reasons recently, just as it has been in the past? Okay, I want to turn to politics, part 2 of my legal breakdown here, and it's my YouTube channel. You can subscribe if you want to get these kind of reports, because I want to go a little deeper than sometimes we get to do when I'm anchoring, and just touch on the lame duck of it all. Because Donald Trump is clearly trying to distort and change how we think of a second-term presidency. And I just made a couple notes here, for example, because Donald Trump won the election last year, and he improved his vote totals from before. He doesn't have some giant mandate. He won by about 1.5 points, but he won. But very quickly, early in his second term, he's doing worse than most second-term presidents. His approval is low, and the public protests are some of the largest we've seen in the last decades. And yet, against that backdrop, if you follow this stuff, there is this feeling that like he's getting away with a lot, and there's almost like a panic or an alert sometimes, given what he's doing to prosecute enemies, to try to get a comic like Jimmy Kimmel kicked off the air, to abuse the FCC powers. You've got companies openly talking about just doing corrupt deals with him. He's pocketing billions through his family and crypto. Some of that may be technically legal. Some of it may raise questions about corruption, conflicts, bribery, impeachable offenses. And so there's this real split you see between what he seems to be getting away with and a kind of a brazen approach, and then the actual fact that he cannot run again, which has been discussed recently. He's constitutionally limited. He is a lame duck. We're about a year out from midterms, which could drastically change the power balance in Washington, and people start planning for what happens after. And so I just wanted to mention, looking at that, some examples. George W. Bush was far more popular than Donald Trump at Bush's peak, presiding over the unity and the response to 9/11, over 2 wars. His approval was up over 80%, but it plummeted by the end of his second term down to 45%, and the Republican Party, moved on without him. If you go further back, it was a different era. Harry Truman came in and was seen as a strong leader at times, but between the Korean War and domestic challenges, he actually bottomed out under 30%, as low as mid-20s, and was seen sort of as a failed president, and people, again, moving on from him. Donald Trump right now, depending on which poll you check, it adjusts, is way below where he was just a year ago, right? November election when he won, came in with about 50%. Now going into November, and he's down in high 30s. And a year from now, next November, is the midterms. And so he's not exactly on a course where it looks really strong. He's really on a course where it looks like he could be much more of a lame duck earlier in his second term. The difference between him and other presidents would be what some call the autocratic attacks, the efforts to distort democracy. You don't have to dislike Donald Trump or dislike his policies to have noticed that he's trying to keep the military out in the streets indefinitely without reason, that he's doing the DOJ crackdowns I mentioned, that he's trying to distort, and so how we have civic democracy. And so I think that's going to be this big contrast going forward, is on the one hand, he's already actually doing worse than most second-term presidents earlier on, and people in his party and in politics will start to plan for after him. That's kind of an iron law of politics when you can't run again. And senators are on 6-year terms while he's on his way out, even in his own party. But one big difference is the very obvious effort to distort all that and to use intimidation in business and media, crackdowns, to actually mute or lower and distort the level of opposition that there is. And so to say something pretty obvious, that's a reminder that that opposition really matters. If it didn't matter, they wouldn't be working so hard and taking so many risks, including, maybe not for him, but for his aides, legal risks in the future, just to try to get you or people in America confused about how unpopular and opposed the current agenda is. That's one more breakdown I wanted to share. Again, you can follow and subscribe to my YouTube channel and stay engaged.